because I called it, but that's what happened.
So in Dallas, in the conversation we were having, you talked about Social Security running out, I think
Yep.
in 2028,
Yep.
and the catastrophe that awaits with that. How does that tie into all this? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a practical reality that's objectively true, and then there's Dave Martin's theory on the motivation. So let's start with the practical reality. When Social Security was set up, it was supposed to be a safety net, and it was supposed to be a means by which seniors and people with various disadvantages were not left on the side of the road by our society. And it sounded like a laudable goal, and it probably had some laudable merit to it. The problem is, from the 1970s forward, Social Security became a bit of a Ponzi scheme, which was we took money in the present to pay off the obligations that we had already made, but then we started borrowing against the trust fund, and we started using the trust fund as a slush fund. And by the 1980s, it became very clear that the design of Social Security, which was a long-dated asset pension management program, had been hijacked by then Congress and the White House to be the piggy bank that you could rob with the promise that one day you'll pay it back. But like all piggy banks that you rob, you don't keep the other half. You don't pay it back.
Yeah.
And so what happened was we ran into a little problem. And the big version of the little problem was when we started in the early 2000s to realize that the actuarial projections, which is the calculation that you make if you're an asset holder, you make calculations on how you're going to fulfill your obligations. In the early 2000s, we realized we had a problem. And the problem was that we were going to run out of money, or we were going to have to increase the Social Security tax. Now, imagine if you're the Bush administration, you've just gone through 9/11 and you drop the bomb that says, hey, we need to increase Social Security tax by 10%. That goes over like a lead balloon, as you can well imagine. And so when we could have fixed this, not only did we choose not to, but we did something that's even worse. And here's the death knell of Social Security. In 2001, the patriotic thing to do was get a second mortgage on your house and spend money to help prop up the economy. So everybody went out, got second mortgages on their house, paid off their credit cards, and then wound up loading up their credit cards, now turning their real estate into essentially an ATM of consumer debt. The reason why we had the global financial crisis in 2008 is because that debt came due, and it turns out people didn't pay. And so there was an enormous financial failure. But here's where the problem comes in. The problem is much of the investments that were meant to support long-dated assets, like pension programs, like Social Security, like Medicare, and like Medicaid, those programs were in fact buying assets which were junk bonds. They were credit default swaps. They were derivatives. They were all kinds of other things. And when that market collapsed, any hope of surviving as Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid's trust fund went to zero. And by the way, by 2011 was the last time we could have fixed the problem. By 2011. Those of you counting here, this is 2021. So we're 10 years over the edge of the cliff, and we're like the Wile E. Coyote running past the clouds and hoping that we don't look down, because we know what happens when we look down. We actually fall, and there's an anvil above us that lands on our head. We don't want to have that happen. But here's the interesting challenge, and this is the fact. The fact is that we know the Social Security Trust Fund runs to zero in 2028. And that's assuming that we don't have any more manipulations of fixed income prices, that the central banks don't actually continue to keep rates artificially low. None of those assumptions, by the way, even have a chance of holding. So what I just said is the tooth fairy. It won't happen. We're going to run out before 2028. Here's the big problem. We have 86 million Americans right now for whom Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is the primary source of livelihood. That number could go to 120 million by the time we get roughly to 2028. Now's the problem. And this is where we go into the theory. Dave's theory is that we don't want 120 million Americans over the age of 65 in 2028. And I don't think it's much of a theory. I don't think it's much of a reach. to suggest the fact that when the CDC and the FDA, with no justification whatsoever, decided that we start injecting people at 65, which, by the way, was the first alleged population of interest, despite the fact that there was not a single shred of empirical evidence to suggest that age had anything to do with infectivity or illness. What did have something to do with infectivity and illness was other concomitant problems, heart disease, diabetes, all these other kind of things. But age wasn't that. But the fact that they went after age tells me that the reason why I have a hunch that this was an intentional harming of the over 65 population is because over 65 is only relevant in the Social Security paradigm. So if you bump off people who allegedly have lived a full life, blah, 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 we're going to call it an unfortunate thing, but decreasing that population, I don't think is an accident. And I think the likelihood is by 2028, we are going to sit back and go, oh my gosh, did that really happen? And the answer is, not only did it really happen, it was designed to happen because we needed to shrink the beneficiary pool by 2028. And that is real because it's another form of gerrymandering.
Wow.
It turns out that if you kill the over 65 population, Seth, you know where you actually get to redistrict? Think about it.
Yeah.
Think about who votes which side of which ticket.
Exactly. I remember seeing all the nursing home stories in California, in New York City, very blue city. I used to live there. Where's your conservative population? Well, it's wherever there's going to be people that are 60s, 70s, 80s plus. So that maybe that was just the beginning step of
listen, I mean, it is a travesty that we don't talk about this, but there is no question that the reckless mistreatment of senior citizens that took place under the Cuomo administration in New York, that took place in New Jersey by Phil Murphy, the horrible things that were done by Gavin Newsom in California, these were willful acts of indifference towards senior citizens. That's the reason why when I talk about this as my theory, and by the way, I'm saying it's a theory. I'm not telling you that it is, that somewhere there's chapter and verse that some nefarious plan has in a notebook that says this. But the fact of the matter is, if you are going to solve the Social Security problem, and just political expediency 101, Seth, if we're going to solve this problem, we got one of two options. And by the way, the Social Security Administration themselves says this. We can either increase the Social Security tax right now, 15%, and decrease benefits by 20%. That, by the way, is how you get to 2030. You heard what I said. Increase tax by 15%, decrease benefits by 20% today, just to survive to 2030. Now, politically, is that more or less acceptable than creating the cover story of a pandemic that allegedly killed off grandpa and grandma?
So do you think that a lot of politicians are aware of this?
Yes.
Really?
And I think a lot of politicians know that they can't handle the notion that maybe the public, if they were told the truth, would actually be able to have their moment of grief. Because let's face it, what I'm saying is an unfortunate reality. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a world where politicians are more than happy to get elected in the next cycle, but who are unwilling to deliver the painful message that says, guess what? Promises made in the 1940s and 1950s are broken promises. We didn't make them, but we are the stewards of their failure. And now, as responsible human beings, we are going to do the right thing, which is to confront these issues head on and trust Americans to actually be responsible and say, okay, we'll take an ounce of pain. Listen, go back to the Second World War. And I tell people this repeatedly because it's a part of history we fail to understand. We chose to have less tires on the road. We chose to consume less gasoline because it was patriotic to make sure resources were available for the war effort. Americans are willing to do the thing they're called to do if they see that it is done equivalently, if they see everybody is shouldering some of the burden and having some of the pain. We are a people who are willing to make sacrifices for the common good, but we have to be told the truth. And it can't be sacrifices for some, but, oh, by the way, if we're elected, it doesn't apply to us. It's got to be sacrificed across the board. We can handle the truth. And the tragedy is our elected officials are unwilling to embrace that.
Yeah. So do you think that's why a lot of politicians are not talking about deaths from the vaccine, and even Trump perhaps is not talking about, not pointing towards the deaths from the vaccines?
Well, there's no question